In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where whispers carry more weight than proclamations, a 6-year-old boy was about to shatter centuries of royal protocol with just a few innocent words. What Prince Louis said that day would not only shock the gathered crowd, but would also set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter how the world sees the British royal family. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were live, and no one, not even his parents, saw it coming. This is the story of how the youngest Cambridge child became the most talked-about royal of his generation, all because he decided to speak his mind when everyone expected him to stay silent. Sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes it takes a child to say what adults have been thinking for years. The morning of June 15, 2024, started like any other Saturday at Adelaide Cottage. Prince William was already up, reviewing his schedule for the day, while Catherine finished getting ready for what was supposed to be a routine family appearance at the annual Children's Garden Party at Buckingham Palace. Their 3 children were in various states of preparation, with Princess Charlotte helping 9-year-old Prince George with his tie, while 6-year-old Prince Louis sat on his bed, staring out the window with an unusually serious expression. Catherine had noticed that Louis had been quieter than usual for the past few days. The youngest of the Wales children was known for his infectious laugh and boundless energy, but lately he seemed more thoughtful, almost contemplative. When she asked him about it over breakfast earlier that week, he had simply shrugged and said he was thinking about things. Catherine assumed it was just a phase that many children go through as they start to understand the world around them better. The Children's Garden Party was an annual tradition that brought together families from various charities and organizations that the royal family supported. It was always held in the beautiful gardens of Buckingham Palace, with activities designed to engage children while giving parents and guardians the opportunity to meet members of the royal family in a more relaxed setting. For the Wales children, it was one of their favorite events because it felt less formal than other royal engagements, and they could actually play and interact with other children their age. As the family made their way to Buckingham Palace in their official car, Louis pressed his face against the window, watching the London streets pass by. His siblings were chatting about the activities they hoped to participate in at the garden party, but Louis remained unusually quiet. William caught his youngest son's reflective mood in the rearview mirror and made a mental note to keep an eye on him during the event. The palace gardens had been transformed into a wonderland for children. There were game stations, art activities, a small petting zoo, and even a miniature obstacle course. The lawn was dotted with colorful tents and banners, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air as families began arriving for the afternoon festivities. Members of the press were positioned at designated areas, capturing candid moments of the royal family interacting with their guests. When the Wales family arrived, they were greeted by palace staff who briefed them on the day's schedule. They would move through different activity stations, spending time with families and children at each one. The children were encouraged to participate in the activities, and there would be a brief informal gathering near the end where families could ask questions or simply chat with the royal family members. George and Charlotte immediately gravitated toward a group of children who were working on a large collaborative art project, painting a mural that depicted their dreams for the future. Louis, however, seemed more interested in observing than participating. He walked alongside his parents as they moved from station to station, politely shaking hands with adults and smiling for photos, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere. At the face-painting station, a little girl around Louis's age approached him shyly. She had been painted with butterfly wings on her cheeks and wore a bright yellow dress that was slightly too big for her. Her name was Emma, and her family had been invited because her father worked with a charity that helped children with disabilities access recreational activities. Emma looked at Louis with wide eyes and whispered, "Are you really a prince?" Louis nodded and asked if she would like to sit with him while they both got their faces painted. As they sat side by side, Emma began telling Louis about her younger brother who used a wheelchair and how much he loved coming to events like this because it made him feel included. The face painter, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Henderson who had been volunteering at royal events for over a decade, listened to their conversation while carefully painting a lion on Louis's cheek and a rainbow on Emma's forehead. She was struck by how intently Louis listened to Emma's stories and how thoughtful his questions were for such a young child. Emma explained that her brother couldn't come today because he had been in the hospital, but she was taking lots of pictures to show him later. She pulled out a small disposable camera and asked if she could take a picture with Louis. As they posed together, Emma mentioned that her brother always wondered what it would be like to live in a palace and whether princes and princesses ever felt lonely living in such a big place. Louis considered this question seriously before responding that sometimes big places could feel empty, even when they were full of people. Mrs. Henderson paused in her face painting, surprised by the depth of the observation from such a young child. Emma nodded knowingly and said that her brother felt the same way sometimes in the hospital. As the afternoon progressed, the royal family moved through various activities. At the storytelling tent, Catherine read from a collection of children's books while parents and children gathered around on colorful cushions. William participated in a friendly football match with some of the older children, and George and Charlotte took turns helping younger children navigate the obstacle course. Louis found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the garden where an elderly man named Albert was sitting alone on a bench, watching all the activities with a gentle smile. Albert had been invited as the grandfather of one of the participating families, but his granddaughter was off playing with friends, leaving him to observe from a distance. Albert noticed Louis approaching and patted the space beside him on the bench. They sat together for a few minutes, watching the other children play. Albert began sharing stories about his own childhood and how different things were when he was growing up. He talked about how children had fewer organized activities, but spent more time talking with adults and learning from their experiences. Louis found himself opening up to Albert in a way that surprised even himself. He began talking about how sometimes he wondered what his life would be like if he wasn't a prince, whether he would have more friends who liked him for who he was rather than what his title meant. Albert listened carefully, recognizing the wisdom and vulnerability in the young boy's words. Albert shared that in his experience, the most important thing about any person wasn't their title or their house, or even their family, but how they treated other people and whether they tried to make the world a little bit better. He told Louis that he had already seen evidence that the young prince had a good heart, and that was worth more than any crown. As their conversation continued, other children and adults began to gather around, drawn by the sight of Prince Louis having such an earnest discussion with Albert. Mrs. Henderson, the face painter, found herself stopping her work to listen. Emma approached with her camera, wanting to capture the moment, and several other families began to form a loose circle around the bench. William and Catherine noticed the gathering crowd and made their way over, initially concerned that Louis might be feeling overwhelmed. Instead, they found their youngest son engaged in what appeared to be a meaningful conversation with Albert, while other guests listened respectfully. Albert was in the middle of explaining how every person has something valuable to contribute to the world, regardless of their age or circumstances, when one of the press photographers positioned near the garden's edge noticed the informal gathering and began taking pictures from a distance. The atmosphere was warm and inclusive, with children asking questions and adults nodding along with Albert's gentle wisdom. Louis seemed more animated than he had been all day, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own observations about fairness and friendship. It was then that Emma, still holding her disposable camera, asked the question that would set everything in motion. She looked directly at Louis and said, "My brother wants to know if being a prince means you always have to pretend to be happy, even when you're not." The question hung in the air, and everyone around the bench fell silent. Even the adults seemed to lean in, curious about how the 6-year-old prince would respond to such a direct and perceptive question. Louis looked around at all the faces watching him expectantly, and for the first time that day, he seemed to truly consider not just what he wanted to say, but what he felt he needed to say. Catherine and William exchanged glances, both recognizing that their son was on the verge of saying something significant. The press photographer continued taking pictures, unaware that he was about to capture one of the most talked-about moments in recent royal history. Louis stood up from the bench, looked around at the gathered crowd of children and adults, and took a deep breath. The garden party continued around them, but in this small corner of Buckingham Palace's grounds, Everyone was waiting to hear what the youngest prince had to say. Louis looked around at all the expectant faces surrounding him. Emma held her camera ready. Albert sat forward with encouraging eyes, and even some adults who had been passing by had stopped to listen. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on the young prince's shoulders, but instead of being intimidated, he appeared to find strength in the genuine curiosity and kindness of the people around him. Emma, Louis began, his voice clear and steady despite his young age. I think your brother is very smart to ask that question. Sometimes I do have to smile when I don't feel like smiling, and sometimes I have to wave when I just want to put my hands in my pockets. The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word. But you know what I've learned? Everyone has to do that sometimes, not just princes. He gestured toward the garden party happening around them. Look at all these grown-ups today. I bet some of them are tired or worried about something at home, or maybe they had an argument with someone this morning. But they're all here being nice to each other and making sure we children have fun. That's not pretending to be happy. That's choosing to be kind even when it's hard. Mrs. Henderson, who had abandoned her face-painting station completely, found herself wiping away a tear. Several other adults nodded in agreement, surprised by the emotional intelligence of the young prince's response. Albert leaned back on the bench with a satisfied smile. That's very wise, young man. But what about when the pretending becomes too much? What do you do then? Louis considered this carefully. Well, I talk to Mama and Papa, and sometimes I talk to Charlotte and George, even though Charlotte can be a bit bossy. This earned a few chuckles from the crowd. But mostly, I try to remember what my great-granny used to tell Papa. She said that being royal isn't about wearing crowns or living in palaces. It's about serving people and trying to make their lives a little bit better. Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. Louis was quoting Queen Elizabeth II, though she wasn't sure where he had heard those exact words. William recognized them too. They were from a private conversation he had shared with his grandmother years ago, one he thought none of the children had overheard. Emma raised her hand like she was in school. But what if people only like you because you're a prince? How do you know who your real friends are? This question seemed to strike something deep in Louis. He sat back down on the bench next to Albert, and his expression became more serious. That's the hardest part, he admitted. Sometimes I wonder if people would still want to play with me if I was just Louis from down the street. But then I think about you, Emma, and how you're talking to me right now. You're not asking me for anything. You're just being my friend. He looked around at the gathered crowd. And all of you are listening to what I'm saying, not just taking pictures or trying to get me to wave. That makes me think that maybe there are more real friends out there than I thought. A young boy around George's age who had been listening from the back of the group raised his hand. My dad says your family gets lots of money from the government. Do you think that's fair when some kids don't have enough food? The adults in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of question that royal children were usually shielded from, and that adult royals would typically deflect with diplomatic non-answers. Catherine and William both took a step forward, ready to intervene if necessary, but Louis was already formulating his response. I think about that a lot, Louis said honestly. Papa and Mama have explained to us that our family has been given a lot of things, but that means we have to work really hard to help other people. That's why we visit hospitals and charities and try to raise money for people who need it more than we do. He paused, seeming to wrestle with how to express a complex thought. But you're right that it doesn't seem fair. I didn't do anything special to be born a prince. I didn't earn it. So I think the only way to make it fair is to use what I've been given to help others. When I grow up, I want to make sure no kids are hungry while other people have too much. The crowd was completely silent now. Several adults were recording on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A 6-year-old member of the British royal family was having an unrehearsed, unfiltered conversation about inequality, privilege, and social responsibility. Albert reached over and patted Louis on the shoulder. Young man, you're going to make a fine king someday. Louis looked surprised. Oh, I probably won't be king. That's George's job. He's the oldest, so he'll be king after Papa. I'll probably just be a duke or something. And how do you feel about that? Asked a woman who had been quietly listening from the edge of the group. She was Dr. Sarah Williams, a child psychologist who had been invited because of her work with traumatized children. Lewis thought about this question for a long moment. Sometimes I feel bad for George because everyone expects so much from him. He has to be perfect all the time, and that must be really hard. But sometimes I feel a little bit left out, like maybe I'm not as important. Catherine felt her heart break a little. She and William had tried so hard to make sure all three children felt equally loved and valued. But, clearly, Lewis was already beginning to understand the hierarchical nature of his family's role in society. But then, Lewis continued, I realized that maybe being less important means I can do different things. Maybe I can take bigger risks or say things that George can't say because he has to be more careful. Maybe I can be friends with people that a future king couldn't be friends with. Emma had been listening intently and now raised her hand again. What kind of things would you want to say that George can't? Lewis glanced toward his parents, who were both watching with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Well, like right now, I don't think George could sit here and talk to all of you like this. Everyone would expect him to be more royalish. But you're all teaching me things, and I like learning from people. Dr. Williams found herself asking, What have you learned today, Prince Louis? I've learned that being curious about people is more important than being polite to them, Louis said immediately. I mean, being polite is good too, but Emma taught me more about kindness in 5 minutes than I've learned in hours of grown-ups telling me how to shake hands properly. This comment drew laughs from several adults, but also knowing looks between parents who recognized the truth in his observation. A teenage girl who had been helping with the face painting spoke up. Do you ever wish you could just be a normal kid? Louis nodded vigorously. Every day, I want to go to a regular school and have sleepovers and not have people taking pictures of me when I'm just trying to eat ice cream. He paused. But then, I think about all the amazing people I get to meet, like Albert and Emma and all of you. And I realize that being normal might mean missing out on conversations like this one. Albert chuckled. Son, I hate to break it to you, but this conversation isn't normal either. Most 6-year-olds aren't this thoughtful about life. Maybe that's because most 6-year-olds don't have to think about this stuff, Louis replied. Maybe if more kids got to talk to adults about important things instead of just playing games all the time, they'd be thoughtful too. The crowd was growing larger now, as word spread through the garden party that Prince Louis was having an extraordinary conversation with guests. Palace staff were beginning to look nervous, and Catherine could see royal protection officers subtly positioning themselves closer to the group. William made the decision to approach the circle. Louis, this has been a wonderful conversation, but perhaps we should continue moving through the garden party so everyone gets a chance to participate in the activities. But Emma, emboldened by Louis's openness, called out, Prince William, can I ask you something? William, caught off guard by the direct address, nodded. Of course. Do you think Prince Louis is right about the money thing? About it not being fair? The garden party had essentially stopped around this impromptu forum. Other activities continued in the distance, but most of the guests and staff were now gathered around or straining to hear the conversation happening near Albert's bench. William looked at his youngest son, who was watching him with keen interest, clearly wondering how his father would handle the same challenging questions he had just navigated. Catherine stepped closer, ready to support whatever approach William chose to take. This was the moment when the carefully managed, protocol-driven world of royal public appearances collided head-on with the unscripted honesty of a 6-year-old boy who had decided to speak his truth. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was listening, and there was no going back to the safe, predictable interactions that usually characterized royal family events. The next few minutes would determine not just how this garden party ended, but how the royal family would be perceived by a public increasingly hungry for authenticity from their public figures. William looked down at Emma, then at his son, and then at the expectant faces of the crowd that had gathered around them. He could feel the weight of centuries of royal protocol pressing down on him, urging him to deflect the question with a diplomatic non-answer. But looking at Louis, who had just demonstrated a level of honesty and vulnerability that was both inspiring and terrifying, William made a decision that would change everything. Emma, William said, crouching down so he was at her eye level, Louis is absolutely right. The system isn't fair. My children didn't choose to be born into privilege any more than other children choose to be born into hardship. The only thing that makes it acceptable is what we do with the advantages we've been given." The crowd was completely silent. A member of the British royal family had just publicly acknowledged that the monarchy was fundamentally unfair. Catherine felt her breath catch, knowing that this moment would be dissected and analyzed by media and constitutional experts for years to come. But William wasn't finished. "Lewis has reminded me today that we have a responsibility to be honest with you, especially with young people who are smart enough to ask difficult questions. We can't ask for your respect and support while pretending that everything about our situation is perfectly reasonable." Albert nodded approvingly. "Now that's the kind of leadership this country needs." "Honesty," Dr. Williams, the child psychologist, found herself asking. "Prince William, how do you help your children cope with the psychological pressure of their positions?" William stood up, looking thoughtful. "We try to teach them that their worth as human beings has nothing to do with their titles. We want them to understand that they're loved for who they are, not what they represent. But, honestly, it's a daily challenge." He gestured toward Lewis. "Today, Lewis has shown me that perhaps we've been underestimating our children's ability to handle complex truths. Maybe instead of protecting them from difficult questions, we should be helping them develop the tools to address those questions thoughtfully." Emma raised her hand again. "Prince Louis, do you think the Queen would be proud of what you said today?" Lewis's face lit up. "Great-Granny always told us to be truthful and kind. I think she would like that I was honest with you, even if some grown-ups might think I said too much." Catherine finally spoke up. "Actually, Louis, I think your great-grandmother would be very proud. She always believed that the monarchy's strength came from its ability to evolve and connect with people authentically." A man in the crowd called out, "Princess Catherine, do you worry that conversations like this might undermine the monarchy?" Catherine exchanged a look with William before responding. "I worry more about the monarchy becoming irrelevant because it's out of touch with reality. If we can't have honest conversations about difficult topics, then we're not serving the people effectively." The teenage girl who had asked about being normal spoke up again. "But doesn't this conversation change everything? I mean, once you've admitted the system is unfair, how do you justify continuing it?" This was the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Lewis, who had started this entire discussion, looked around at the faces of the people who had become his impromptu philosophy discussion group. "Maybe," Lewis said slowly, "the point isn't to justify the system. Maybe the point is to change it, bit by bit, until it becomes something better." Albert clapped his hands together. From the mouths of babes, Dr. Williams leaned forward. "Lewis, what would you change if you could?" "I would make sure every kid gets to go to school and have enough food," Lewis said immediately. "And I would make it so that being born in a palace doesn't make you more important than being born anywhere else. But I would keep the parts that help people, like when we visit hospitals and raise money for charities." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds fair. But how would you do that?" Lewis looked stumped for a moment, then brightened. "I would ask people like you what they think. I would listen to lots of different people and try to understand what they need. And I wouldn't make decisions just by talking to other people who live in palaces." William found himself genuinely impressed by his son's reasoning. "Lewis, you've just described democratic governance. That's how countries should be run. But we don't live in a democracy when it comes to the royal family," pointed out the teenage girl. "We don't get to vote for our king or queen." This observation created another moment of silence. Lewis looked confused. "We don't. But if the people don't choose their king or queen, how do they know if they're doing a good job?" Catherine realized that they were venturing into constitutional territory that could have significant implications. "Lewis, these are very complex questions that political scientists and historians have been debating for centuries." "But they shouldn't be complex," Lewis insisted. "If something doesn't make sense to a 6-year-old, maybe there's something wrong with it." Albert laughed heartily. "Young man, you've just summarized the best approach to political analysis I've heard in decades." The crowd was now substantial, and palace staff were becoming visibly anxious. The press photographers were having a field day, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming a historic event. A woman who had been quiet until now spoke up. "I'm a teacher, and I have to ask, Prince Louis, Do you think children should have more say in important decisions that affect them? Lewis's eyes lit up at this question. Yes, adults are always making rules for kids without asking us what we think. Like at school, they decide what we should learn and when we should learn it, but they don't ask us what we're curious about. The teacher nodded. That's very insightful. How would you change that? I would have meetings where kids could tell adults what they think, Lewis said enthusiastically. And not just pretend meetings where adults smile and nod and then do whatever they were going to do anyway. Real meetings where what kids say actually matters. William and Catherine were both realizing that their 6-year-old was articulating political philosophies that many adult politicians struggled to express clearly. Emma, who had been the catalyst for this entire conversation, raised her hand one more time. Prince Louis, my brother wants to know if you'll still remember us tomorrow, or if this is just something that happens, and then you forget about it. This question seemed to hit Louis differently than the others. His expression became very serious, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. Emma, I promise I won't forget you or your brother or anyone here today. This conversation has taught me more about being a good person than any lesson I've ever had. But more than that, I want to keep talking to people like this. I don't want this to be just one special day. He looked around at all the faces watching him. Would you all want to keep talking sometimes? Not at fancy parties, but just talking about things that matter. Albert raised his hand. I'm in. Dr. Williams nodded. I think many of us would be interested in continuing these conversations. The teacher agreed. This is exactly the kind of dialogue we need more of. William looked at Catherine, and they both realized that their son had just committed them to something unprecedented. Ongoing, unfiltered public engagement with ordinary citizens about fundamental questions of governance, fairness, and social responsibility. Catherine made a decision that surprised even herself. Louis, if you're serious about wanting to continue these conversations, then we'll find a way to make that happen. But it means you'll have to be prepared for people to disagree with you, to challenge your ideas, and to expect you to defend your positions. Louis nodded solemnly. I think I can handle that. These people today have been disagreeing with me and challenging my ideas, and it's been the best conversation I've ever had. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. What had started as a simple garden party had transformed into something none of them had expected. A genuine dialogue between royalty and citizens, mediated by the unfiltered honesty of a 6-year-old boy who had decided to speak his truth. But as the applause died down, everyone present realized that this moment had created expectations and commitments that would be impossible to ignore. The question now was whether the royal family would follow through on the implicit promises that had been made, or whether this would become just an interesting anecdote that gradually faded from public memory. The answer to that question would determine not just Louis's future, but the future of the monarchy itself. The days following the garden party unfolded like nothing the royal family had ever experienced. By Sunday morning, videos of Louis's conversation were trending on every social media platform. News outlets around the world were running stories with headlines like 6-year-old prince challenges monarchy and royal child speaks truth to power. The palace's phone lines were jammed with interview requests, and the family's private social media accounts were flooded with messages from people who had been moved by Louis's honesty. William and Catherine found themselves in emergency meetings with senior royal advisors, constitutional experts, and communications specialists who were trying to figure out how to manage what many were calling the most significant public relations crisis the monarchy had faced in decades. The more traditional advisors argued that the family needed to issue a statement clarifying that Louis's comments were those of a child who didn't understand the complexities of constitutional monarchy. They suggested that future public appearances should be more carefully controlled to prevent similar incidents. But there was another faction, led by some of the younger advisors who had been pushing for modernization of the royal family's public engagement strategy, who argued that Louis had accomplished something remarkable. He had made the monarchy relevant and relatable to a generation that had been increasingly indifferent to royal traditions. They pointed to polling data showing that public approval of the royal family had actually increased following Louis's comments, particularly among younger demographics. Catherine found herself caught between her instincts as a mother to protect her child from public scrutiny and her growing realization that Lewis had tapped into something important. As she read through hundreds of messages from parents whose children had watched the videos and started asking their own thoughtful questions about fairness and leadership, she began to understand that her son had started a conversation that the country needed to have. William was struggling with similar conflicted feelings. On one hand, he was proud of Lewis's intelligence and compassion. On the other hand, he was acutely aware that his 6-year-old had just committed the family to a level of transparency and accountability that would be challenging to maintain. The promise to continue conversations with ordinary citizens couldn't be easily walked back without looking like the royal family was retreating from their commitments. Meanwhile, Lewis himself seemed largely unaware of the storm he had created. He went to school on Monday morning as usual, though his teachers reported that his classmates were asking him about the videos their parents had shown them. Lewis responded to their questions with the same thoughtful honesty he had shown at the garden party, apparently not understanding why everyone was treating his comments as revolutionary. It was Emma's mother, Mrs. Sarah Chun, who provided the catalyst for what happened next. She called the palace on Tuesday morning and asked to speak with someone about organizing a follow-up conversation. When she was initially told that the royal family's schedule was fully booked for the foreseeable future, she politely but firmly reminded the staff member that Prince Louis had made a promise to her daughter and the other children who had been present. "My daughter has been telling everyone at school about her conversation with Prince Louis," Mrs. Chun explained to the increasingly uncomfortable palace communications director. "She's been asking when they're going to talk again. I understand that royal schedules are complicated, but Louis made a commitment to these children, and they're taking it seriously." This call was followed by similar calls from Albert's daughter, Dr. Williams, the teacher who had participated in the conversation, and several other families who had been present at the garden party. By Wednesday, the palace was receiving dozens of calls from people who had seen the videos and wanted to participate in future discussions. Catherine and William realized they were at a crossroads. They could either find a way to honor Louis's commitments, which would require creating an entirely new model for royal public engagement, or they could disappoint the very people their son had connected with, potentially damaging both Louis's credibility and the monarchy's reputation for keeping its promises. The solution came from an unexpected source. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, attended one of the family's crisis meetings and cut through the debate with characteristic directness. "The boy made a promise," she said simply. "Royal promises matter. If we start breaking promises to children, what does that say about our word to anyone else?" She suggested that instead of trying to control or limit Louis's future interactions, the family should embrace them as an opportunity to demonstrate that the monarchy could evolve and adapt to meet the needs of contemporary society. Besides, and added with a slight smile, "The child has already proven he can handle himself in these situations better than most trained diplomats." This endorsement from one of the most respected senior royals gave William and Catherine the confidence to move forward with a plan that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. They decided to establish what they called community conversations, regular, informal meetings between members of the royal family and ordinary citizens to discuss issues of mutual concern. The first official community conversation was scheduled for the following Saturday at a community center in South London. Unlike traditional royal visits, there would be no receiving lines, no prepared remarks, and no predetermined agenda. Instead, participants would sit in a circle and discuss whatever topics emerged naturally, with the understanding that everyone's voice would be valued equally. When Louis learned about the plans for the community conversation, his reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Can Emma come? And Albert? And Dr. Williams?" he asked. When assured that all of the original participants would be invited, Louis began planning what he wanted to talk about. But, as the day approached, both William and Catherine began to have second thoughts. They were about to put their 6-year-old son in an uncontrolled public situation where he would be expected to engage with complex social and political issues. The potential for him to say something that could cause a constitutional crisis or international incident seemed enormous. The night before the community conversation, Catherine sat on Louis's bed for their usual bedtime chat. "Louis," she said gently, "tomorrow is going to be different from the garden party. There will be more people, and Some of them might ask really difficult questions. Are you sure you want to do this? Lewis looked at her seriously. Mama, do you think I said something wrong at the garden party? Catherine considered her answer carefully. No, darling. I think you said exactly what you believed, and that was very brave. But some people think that royal children shouldn't talk about certain topics. What topics? Lewis asked. Well, topics about whether the monarchy is fair, or about politics, or about social issues that are controversial. Lewis was quiet for a moment. But if we can't talk about important things, what's the point of talking at all? This question stopped Catherine short. She realized that her son had put his finger on exactly why his original comments had resonated with so many people. In a world where public figures routinely avoided difficult questions and spoke in meaningless platitudes, Lewis's willingness to engage honestly with complex issues was refreshing and rare. You're right, Catherine said finally. Important conversations require talking about important things. Then, we should keep doing it.